Chris and Laura were the kind of couple that turned heads. From their shared playlists to the way they finished each other's sentences, they seemed almost too good to be true. Friends often joked that they were destined for a movie-worthy love story. For a year, their relationship had been filled with laughter, spontaneous road trips, and quiet evenings cooking together in Laura's cozy apartment. It was on one such evening, as Laura diced vegetables in their small kitchen, that Chris walked in, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Smells amazing," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. Laura laughed. "That's just the onions," she teased, swatting him away with her free hand. She couldn't help but marvel at how lucky she felt. Chris was kind, ambitious, and attentive, a rare combination. She often found herself daydreaming about a future with him, complete with a little house and maybe a dog. But perfect things have a way of hiding imperfections. A week later, Laura had an unexpected afternoon off work. Excited at the idea of surprising Chris, she stopped by her favorite bakery for his favorite pastries and headed home. As she approached her apartment, her keys jingling in hand, she noticed Chris's car parked outside. She smiled to herself. He must have skipped class to relax. The moment she opened the door, though, something felt off. The air was heavy, the kind of stillness that warns of a storm. She called out, "Chris? Are you here?" The muffled sound of voices answered her. Laura's smile faltered. She stepped inside, her stomach churning as she followed the faint laughter to her bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open. And there they were. Chris was tangled in the sheets with someone else, a woman Laura recognized from campus, a girl named Tessa who sat a few rows behind Chris in class. They froze, Chris scrambling to cover himself as Laura stood in the doorway, her heart pounding in her chest. "Laura," he stammered, his face a mix of shock and guilt. This isn't what it looks like." Laura's hands trembled, the pastry bag slipping from her grasp and falling to the floor. "Not what it looks like," she echoed, her voice trembling with rage and disbelief. "So what is it, Chris? A team project?" Tessa had the decency to look embarrassed, pulling the blanket around herself as she mumbled an apology and bolted for the door. Chris reached out as if to comfort Laura, but she stepped back, her eyes blazing. "Don't," she hissed. "Don't you dare touch me." Chris began to babble excuses, but Laura couldn't hear him over the roar in her ears. Every sweet word, every tender moment they'd shared felt like a cruel joke. The man she thought she knew, the future she'd imagined, it all dissolved before her eyes. Her voice was eerily calm when she finally spoke. "Get out." Chris hesitated. "Laura, please. Let me explain." "I said, get out," she screamed, her composure cracking as tears spilled down her cheeks. Chris grabbed his clothes and stumbled out the door, leaving Laura alone in the apartment that now felt like a stranger's. She sank onto the bed, the betrayal cutting deeper with every passing second. The woman who believed in fairy tales was gone. In her place was someone broken, someone who would have to find the strength to rebuild herself. The morning after the betrayal, Laura sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the remnants of a mug of tea gone cold. She hadn't slept. Her thoughts were a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and disbelief. How could someone she trusted so deeply, someone she was preparing to marry, betray her in the very space they'd built together? Her phone buzzed. Chris had been calling and texting all night, each message a variation of, "Let me explain," or "Please talk to me." Laura ignored them all. But when the doorbell rang, she knew she couldn't avoid him forever. She opened the door to find Chris standing there, disheveled and holding a bouquet of wilted flowers. "Laura," he began, his voice trembling, "please, just hear me out." Laura folded her arms, her gaze icy. "You have 2 minutes." Chris stepped inside, setting the flowers on the counter like they could somehow erase the memory of what she'd seen. I messed up," he stammered. "I know I hurt you, and I'm so sorry. It was a stupid, one-time mistake." Laura's voice was sharp. "A mistake is spilling coffee on my favorite shirt. You didn't trip and fall into someone else's bed, Chris." He flinched but pressed on. It didn't mean anything, I swear. I've been so stressed about the wedding, about the money, about everything. I wasn't thinking straight. Oh, so this is the wedding's fault now? Laura snapped, her voice rising. That's your excuse for humiliating me? For betraying me in my own home? Chris's eyes darted to the floor. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but Laura, we've built a life together. We've invested so much. The deposits for the venue, the catering, it's all non-refundable. Laura's stomach twisted. Are you seriously trying to guilt me with money right now? He reached for her hands, his expression shifting to one of desperation. I love you, Laura. I made a mistake, but we can get through this. Think about everything we've been through, everything we're planning. Don't throw it all away over one stupid moment. She pulled her hands away, shaking her head. You don't get to decide what this betrayal costs me, Chris. You violated my trust. You made me question everything I thought we had. Chris's tone hardened, the pleading giving way to something colder. You're not perfect either, Laura. Relationships take work, and if you're not willing to put in the effort, maybe this isn't the fairy tale you thought it was. The words hit like a slap, but they also illuminated a truth Laura had been too hurt to see. This wasn't the first time Chris had used manipulation to get his way. There had been smaller moments, subtle digs disguised as jokes, dismissing her concerns with charm, always steering decisions to suit himself. She squared her shoulders, her voice steadier than it had been all morning. You're right, Chris. This isn't a fairy tale. Fairy tales don't have lies and betrayal. But I deserve better than this. I deserve better than you. Chris's jaw clenched. So that's it? You're just going to walk away from everything? Laura's answer was simple. No, Chris. I'm walking toward something better. As she closed the door on him, she felt a mix of sadness and relief. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. She wouldn't let herself be trapped by guilt or manipulation. The weeks leading up to the wedding felt surreal to Laura. It was like watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. Her family and friends gushed over the venue, the flowers, and her custom-designed dress. They couldn't see the fracture lines beneath her carefully composed surface. Laura told herself she was going through with it for practical reasons. Canceling now would cost her a fortune, and she wasn't ready to endure the endless questions and pitying looks. But deep down, she wasn't sure if she was clinging to the idea of the life she'd planned or just too numb to fight anymore. Chris, on the other hand, seemed to flourish as the big day approached. He smoothed things over with their families, putting on a show of affection that made Laura sick. We're stronger than ever, he'd say to guests during the rehearsal dinner, his arm around Laura's stiff shoulders. Laura bit her tongue, knowing any protest would only feed into his narrative of her being too emotional. The wedding day dawned bright and cloudless, mocking her with its perfection. Laura sat in the bridal suite, her hands trembling as her best friend, Sarah, helped her into the dress. You okay? Sarah asked gently, noticing Laura's pale face. Laura forced a smile. Just pre-wedding jitters. Sarah didn't look convinced, but she didn't push. The ceremony itself was beautiful, orchestrated down to the last detail. Laura walked down the aisle, her veil obscuring the turmoil in her eyes. Chris stood at the altar, beaming with pride, the picture of a devoted groom. As the officiant recited the vows, Laura's mind raced. Each word felt heavier than the last. I do, she finally whispered, her voice cracking. Chris grinned and kissed her like he'd won a prize. The reception was a lavish affair, with tables adorned in blush and gold, a string quartet playing softly in the background. Chris worked the room effortlessly, laughing and drinking with friends, basking in the attention. Laura tried to keep up appearances, but her smiles were brittle, her laughter hollow. At one point, she caught Chris flirting with a bridesmaid, his hand lingering on her arm as he leaned in too close. Laura clenched her fists, the betrayal still fresh in her mind. It wasn't just the affair, it was his complete disregard for her feelings, his audacity to act like nothing had happened. Beautiful wedding, Laura, someone said, pulling her from her thoughts. It was one of her distant cousins, holding a champagne flute. You and Chris are perfect together. Laura nodded mechanically, her heart sinking. Perfect. That word again. If only they knew. As the night wore on, Chris grew increasingly drunk, his charming facade slipping. He toasted to himself during the speeches, barely mentioning Laura. When it came time for their first dance, he stumbled through it, laughing off his clumsiness while Laura held her breath, willing the moment to end. Later, Laura found herself alone on the terrace, staring out at the moonlit garden. The muffled sounds of the party drifted behind her, a stark contrast to the silence inside her. She felt trapped in a nightmare, unsure how to wake up. Enjoying the party? Chris's voice startled her. She turned to see him leaning against the doorway, his tie loosened and a smug grin on his face. Laura didn't answer. Come on, babe, he slurred, stepping closer. You're killing the vibe. This is supposed to be the happiest day of our lives. The happiest day, she repeated, her voice low but steady. For who, Chris? Because it sure as hell isn't for me. Chris laughed, brushing off her words. Don't be dramatic, Laura. Look around. Everyone's having a great time. That's what matters. Laura stared at him, a cold clarity washing over her. This was who Chris truly was, selfish, indifferent, incapable of understanding the depth of the pain he'd caused. For the first time that day, she felt something other than despair. She felt resolve. The morning after the wedding, Laura woke to an unfamiliar weight in her chest. The events of the previous day replayed in her mind, and she felt like a stranger in her own life. Chris was still snoring beside her, oblivious to the storm brewing in her heart. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Pulling on a robe, Laura opened it to find Chris's parents standing there, their smiles brittle. Good morning, dear, his mother began, stepping inside uninvited. We hope you're not too tired after yesterday. We have some matters to discuss. Laura frowned, her pulse quickening. Matters? His father cleared his throat. Yes, about the wedding gifts and arrangements for the future. You know, practical things. Chris shuffled into the living room, rubbing his eyes. What's going on? Darling, his mother said, turning to him, we were just saying that it's time to handle the legalities. We need to register Chris as co-owner of the apartment. It only makes sense now that you're married. Laura froze. Register him? In my apartment? Yes, his father chimed in. You inherited it, yes, but now it's part of your marital assets. It's just a formality, really. It's not just a formality, Laura said, her voice sharp. This apartment was my grandmother's. It's been in my family for generations. Chris, now fully awake, threw his arm around her. Come on, babe, it's no big deal. We're married now. What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine, right? Laura pulled away, her stomach twisting. No, Chris. That's not how this works. His mother's smile tightened. Laura, dear, we're just trying to protect Chris's interests. After all, we contributed a significant sum to the wedding. It's only fair that he has some security. Fair? Laura snapped, unable to contain herself. You mean fair for Chris, not for me. Do you think I don't see what this is about? The room grew tense. Chris stepped forward, his tone placating but tinged with irritation. Laura, you're overreacting. They just want to make sure everything is equal. Equal? Laura laughed bitterly. You mean after your affair? After this sham of a wedding? You want me to sign over my apartment so you can feel secure? No, absolutely not. His father's face darkened. Watch your tone, young lady. We're family now, and families take care of each other. Families don't manipulate and exploit each other, Laura shot back. If you think I'm handing over my home after everything that's happened, you're delusional. Chris's patience snapped. Why are you being so difficult? My parents are just trying to help. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Harder for who, Chris? You? Them? None of you seem to care about how I feel in any of this. The conversation spiraled into an argument, revealing the layers of entitlement Chris and his parents had hidden behind their charm. They accused Laura of being selfish and ungrateful, while she fought to protect the one thing she had left from her life before Chris. Finally, Laura stood, her voice shaking but firm. This ends now. You can keep your wedding money. I'll pay you back every cent if that's what you want, but you will not touch my apartment. And you, she said, pointing at Chris, need to decide if you're my husband or their puppet. Because I'm done playing along. Chris's parents left in a huff, muttering about how Laura wasn't the woman they thought she was. Chris stayed silent, his jaw clenched. As the door closed behind them, Laura turned to him. I mean it, Chris. No more manipulation. No more lies. If you can't respect me, then this marriage is over. It started with a bottle of whiskey. Chris came home late, the sharp scent of alcohol wafting in before he did. Laura was sitting in the living room, papers spread across the coffee table. She'd spent the afternoon looking into her legal options, and her resolve to protect herself was stronger than ever. Chris staggered through the door, slamming it shut behind him. Laura, he called out, his voice slurred but menacing. We need to talk. She didn't bother to look up. I think you've had enough for one night, Chris. Go sleep it off. No, he growled, crossing the room in uneven strides. You don't get to dismiss me like that. I'm your husband, damn it. And I'm sick of your attitude. Laura finally looked at him, her eyes cold. My attitude? Chris, you cheated on me, manipulated me, and tried to take what's mine. You're lucky I haven't kicked you out yet. Chris's face darkened. You think you can just boss me around? You're my wife. You have responsibilities, Laura. You're supposed to stand by me, no matter what. Responsibilities? Laura stood, her voice rising. Like letting you treat me like garbage? Like sacrificing my dignity for your ego? Forget it, Chris. He stepped closer, his posture looming. Don't push me, Laura. You owe me. You think you're too good now? After everything I've done for you. Done for me, she snapped, her anger bubbling over. You mean lie, cheat, and exploit me? You've done nothing but tear me down, Chris. I owe you nothing. Chris's face twisted with rage. You don't talk to me like that, he hissed, reaching for her arm. Laura pulled back, her heart pounding. The memories of every degrading moment, every instance of manipulation, flashed through her mind. But this time, she didn't feel fear. She felt fury. Touch me again, and I swear you'll regret it, she said, her voice low and deadly. Chris laughed, the sound bitter and mean. What are you gonna do, Laura? Run crying to your lawyer? You can't handle me. Laura's hand shot out, grabbing a heavy candlestick from the table. She held it firm, her knuckles white. Try me, she said, her voice steady. You take one more step, and I will make you regret every second of this marriage. Chris froze, his bravado faltering at the fire in her eyes. You wouldn't. Wouldn't I? Laura took a step forward, her grip tightening on the candlestick. Do you really want to test me, Chris? Because I've had enough. Enough of your lies, your manipulation, and your cowardice. If you think for 1 second I'll let you control me, you're wrong. Dead wrong. The tension crackled like a live wire. For a moment, Chris looked as if he might push her further, but then something shifted in his expression. He took a step back, muttering under his breath. You're crazy, he said, shaking his head. You're absolutely crazy. Laura lowered the candlestick, but didn't put it down. Get out, she said coldly. Take your things and leave. Now. Chris glared at her, his face a mask of frustration and disbelief. But he didn't argue. He stumbled toward the bedroom, slamming the door behind him. Laura sank into the couch, her hands trembling as the adrenaline coursed through her. She'd stood her ground. For the first time in months, she felt in control. When Chris left the next morning, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, he didn't say goodbye. Laura watched him go, the weight of her decision settling over her. The fight wasn't over, but she knew one thing for certain. She would never let anyone, not Chris, not his family, not anyone, take her power again. A week after Chris left, Laura found herself sitting in a quaint coffee shop on the edge of downtown. She'd been coming here every morning, savoring the quiet hum of strangers and the comforting aroma of fresh coffee. It was a small reprieve from the chaos her life had become. She was lost in thought when a gentle voice interrupted her. Excuse me, is this seat taken? Laura looked up to see a man in his mid-30s, his warm brown eyes crinkling slightly as he smiled. He was tall and carried himself with an air of quiet confidence, his suit sharp but not ostentatious. "No, go ahead," Laura said, motioning to the chair across from her. "Thanks," he said, setting down his laptop and a cup of coffee. "It's packed in here today." Laura nodded, returning to her notebook. She was trying to list out her next steps, legal matters, therapy, work, but the words blurred together. After a few minutes, the man glanced up from his screen. "Are you okay?" She looked at him, startled. "Excuse me?" "I don't mean to pry," he said quickly, holding up his hands. "You just seem distracted. If you want me to mind my own business, I will." For some reason, his genuine tone disarmed her. She laughed softly, the sound surprising even herself. "It's been a rough few weeks," she admitted. He nodded, his expression kind but unobtrusive. "I get that. Life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it." They fell into an easy conversation. His name was James, and he was a project manager for a nonprofit focused on housing equity. He had a natural warmth about him, the kind that made you feel heard even when you weren't saying much. "What about you?" he asked after sharing a bit about himself. "What brings you here?" Laura hesitated, but something about James felt safe. "I'm in the middle of a separation," she said carefully. "It's been messy." James didn't react with the usual awkwardness she'd come to expect from people when she mentioned her situation. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his gaze steady. "I'm sorry to hear that. That kind of thing can be incredibly draining." "It is," Laura admitted. "But it's also been eye-opening. I've learned a lot about myself and about what I won't tolerate." "That's powerful," James said, his tone encouraging. "It takes a lot of strength to stand up for yourself, especially when it feels like the odds are against you." As they talked, Laura found herself opening up more than she expected. She told him about Chris's betrayal, the manipulation from his parents, and the moment she'd finally drawn the line. James listened intently, never interrupting or offering platitudes. "You've been through a lot," he said when she finished. "But from what I can see, you're handling it with grace. It takes courage to choose yourself." Laura felt a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means a lot." Over the next hour, they continued talking, their conversation shifting to lighter topics, favorite books, travel dreams, and the best desserts in town. By the time James glanced at his watch, Laura realized she hadn't thought about Chris once during their conversation. "This has been really nice," James said, standing and gathering his things. "I'm glad I sat here." "Me too," Laura said, smiling. Before he left, James paused. "If you ever need someone to talk to, or just want to grab coffee again, here's my number." He slid a business card across the table, his handwriting scrawled on the back. Laura hesitated for a moment, then took the card. "Thanks, James." As he walked out, Laura felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in weeks, hope. A few days after meeting James, Laura sat in her apartment, surrounded by stacks of legal papers. The weight of everything, divorce, property disputes, Chris's lingering threats, felt suffocating. She picked up her phone and stared at the card James had given her. After a moment's hesitation, she dialed. "James speaking," came his calm voice. "Hi, James. It's Laura." "From the coffee shop?" "Laura." "Hey," he said, his voice brightening. "What's up?" "I need some advice," she admitted. "About legal stuff." "And Chris?" An hour later, they were sitting across from each other again, this time in James's modest office at his nonprofit. He listened carefully as Laura explained the situation, her concerns about Chris trying to claim her apartment, the wedding money his parents demanded, and the impending divorce. "First of all," James said, his expression serious, "you need to protect your apartment." "It's inherited property, right?" Laura nodded. "It was my grandmother's." "Then it's not marital property," he explained. "Chris has no legal claim to it, no matter what he or his parents say. But we need to formalize that with the divorce filing." "Have you spoken to an attorney?" Laura shook her head. I don't even know where to start. James leaned forward. I have a colleague who specializes in family law. I can connect you too. They'll help you draft the divorce petition and secure your rights over the apartment. Relief washed over Laura. That would be amazing. Thank you, James. It's no problem, he said. But there's something else we need to address. Chris still has a key to this place, doesn't he? Her stomach sank. Yes. I asked him to leave, but he hasn't officially moved out. He's been coming and going as he pleases. James frowned. That's not okay. We can file for a formal eviction as part of the divorce proceedings. In the meantime, change the locks. Over the next few days, James's advice became Laura's lifeline. She met with his colleague, a sharp but compassionate attorney named Rachel, who guided her through the legal maze of filing for divorce. They worked together to draft a strong petition, citing Chris's infidelity and financial manipulation. James accompanied Laura to a locksmith, standing by her side as she changed the locks to her apartment. This is your space, he said firmly as the locksmith finished the job. No one gets to take that from you. That evening, when Chris showed up drunk and furious, pounding on the door, Laura didn't waver. I've changed the locks, she said through the door, her voice steady. You're not welcome here anymore. My lawyer will be in touch. Chris shouted threats, calling her names and demanding to be let in, but Laura didn't budge. She called the police, who arrived and escorted him away. By the time the eviction notice was served, Chris had no choice but to collect his remaining things and leave for good. Laura watched from the window as he stormed off, slamming his car door behind him. That's the last time he'll set foot here, James said, standing beside her. You did it, Laura. For the first time in weeks, she smiled. We did it. I couldn't have done this without you. With Chris out of her life and the divorce underway, Laura felt a sense of empowerment she hadn't known before. James continued to offer his support, but he never pushed her to move faster than she was ready. You're building something new, he said one day over coffee. It's okay to take your time. And that's exactly what Laura did, step by step, reclaiming her life and her sense of self. The first thing Laura did after finalizing the locks on her life with Chris was enroll in an online course to complete her degree. It had been a long-standing dream, one she'd put on hold when Chris insisted her time was better spent supporting his ambitions. Now, the thought of focusing on her own goals filled her with a mix of excitement and determination. Balancing her studies with a full-time job wasn't easy, especially as she chipped away at the lingering family debts that weighed heavily on her conscience. Her parents had always sacrificed for her, and now she wanted to return the favor. Late nights were spent poring over coursework, while weekends were dedicated to overtime shifts at work. Through it all, James remained a constant presence. He never hovered or pressed, but his quiet encouragement was like a lifeline. One evening, Laura found herself at James's apartment, invited over for a casual dinner. She'd been hesitant at first, worried about the implications of their growing friendship. But James had insisted. It's just dinner, he said with a reassuring smile. You've been working nonstop, and you deserve a break. As she stepped inside his warm, modest home, she immediately felt at ease. The space was filled with books, cozy furniture, and little signs of a life well lived. He'd made pasta from scratch, the aroma filling the room as soft jazz played in the background. You didn't have to go all out, Laura said, taking a seat at the table. James shrugged, grinning. It's therapeutic for me. Plus, you deserve more than takeout after the week you've had. They talked for hours, the conversation flowing as naturally as it had since the day they met. Laura found herself sharing details about her studies, her goals, and the small victories she was beginning to feel proud of. You're incredible, you know that? James said, pouring her another glass of wine. Laura blushed, shaking her head. I'm just doing what I should have been doing all along. No, he said gently, you're rebuilding your life from the ground up. That's not something everyone can do, Laura. It takes courage. The dynamic between them began to shift subtly after that night. James was still her friend, still her confidant, but there were moments when Laura caught him looking at her with something more in his eyes. And to her surprise, she didn't shy away from it. One afternoon, as they sat in the park discussing one of her classes, James asked, "What's next for you, Laura? What's your dream?" Laura thought for a moment, then smiled. "I want to finish my degree, get a job that challenges me, travel somewhere I've never been, and I want to feel like I'm in control of my life, like I'm not waiting for someone else to decide my worth." James nodded, his expression serious. "You're already doing that. I see it every time we talk." Laura met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. For the first time, she felt like the future she was building wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving. As Laura tackled her goals one by one, James remained by her side, never overshadowing her independence, but always ready to lend a hand. Over time, the lines of their friendship blurred into something deeper, though they both approached it cautiously. For Laura, it wasn't about rushing into something new, it was about learning to trust again, not just in others, but in herself. The day the divorce papers arrived, Laura felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a sense of liberation that made her lighter on her feet. Sitting at her kitchen table, she stared at the envelope for a long moment before finally opening it. The stark black and white text declared what she already knew: her marriage to Chris was over. She picked up her pen and signed her name at the bottom of the document with a steady hand. It felt like closing the door on a room filled with darkness, pain, and betrayal. As the ink dried, she exhaled deeply, a small smile forming on her lips. She was finally free. News of Chris's downfall trickled in over the next few weeks, though Laura hadn't sought it out. It seemed life had a way of catching up to him without her intervention. First, she heard through mutual acquaintances that Chris had been expelled from his university. His affair with Tessa, a fellow student, had come to light in an embarrassing public scandal. Tessa, it turned out, had been working as a teaching assistant for one of Chris's professors, violating university policy. When questioned, Chris tried to charm his way out of trouble, but his arrogance only sealed his fate. Then came the financial troubles. Without a degree or a steady job, Chris struggled to find footing. His parents, furious at the public humiliation, stopped bailing him out, leaving him to fend for himself. Laura felt no sympathy. It was the natural consequence of his own actions. The final blow came when a mutual friend shared that Chris had moved out of town, leaving behind a trail of burned bridges and failed relationships. Laura felt a strange sense of closure, knowing he was no longer part of her world. That evening, James came over to celebrate. He brought takeout from their favorite Thai place and a bottle of champagne. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass. Laura clinked hers against his, smiling. "To moving forward." They sat on her balcony, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Laura shared her thoughts, the highs and lows of the journey she'd been on. "It's strange," she admitted. "For so long, I thought I needed Chris to feel complete. But now, I realize I'm more myself without him." James reached over, taking her hand in his. "You've done the hardest thing anyone can do, Laura. You chose yourself. That's something to be proud of." His words warmed her, and for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she wasn't defined by her past. She glanced at James, feeling the strength of their connection. It was different from what she'd had with Chris, grounded, genuine, and without expectations. As the night wore on, Laura felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The chapter with Chris was over, and the book of her life was hers to write. A year had passed since Laura signed the divorce papers, and her life was finally her own again. Her apartment had transformed into a warm sanctuary of calm and joy. Gone were the shadows of her past, replaced with sunlight streaming through lace curtains, vibrant green plants she nurtured, and books stacked haphazardly on the coffee table, symbols of a life rediscovered. Her career flourished. After finishing her degree, Laura landed a role in a company that valued her ambition and resilience. She'd worked hard, climbing steadily while earning the respect of her colleagues. More than that, she found satisfaction in her work, proof that she was capable, deserving, and unstoppable. James had been a steady presence through it all, though their relationship developed slowly, without the pressure of expectations. They'd spent the year exploring their bond, learning to trust and value each other while respecting Laura's boundaries and her need to heal. One evening, as they prepared dinner in her cozy kitchen, James set down a pot of bubbling marinara sauce and turned to her. "I was thinking," he said, his tone casual but warm, "we should take a trip. Somewhere neither of us has been before." Laura looked up from chopping basil, her lips quirking into a smile. "Where were you thinking?" "Anywhere," he said with a grin. "Italy, Greece, Japan. Maybe everywhere." The idea was tempting, but Laura hesitated. "James, I love the idea, but I'm just starting to feel settled here." James reached across the counter and gently took her hand. "I understand. And I'd never push you to do something you're not ready for. But wherever you want to go, whether it's around the world or just to the corner coffee shop, I'll be right there with you." Later that evening, as they sat on her balcony sipping tea, Laura gazed out at the city lights. For the first time, she realized she wasn't afraid of what came next. She'd faced heartbreak, betrayal, and loss, but she'd also found strength, independence, and self-worth. Her journey had taught her that she didn't need to have all the answers or rush to define her future. What mattered was that she was finally living for herself. "James," she said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I think I'm ready." He looked over, raising an eyebrow. "For the trip?" "For whatever comes next," she replied, her smile growing. "As long as it's on my terms." As they laughed and dreamed together under the stars, Laura knew her story was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, she felt in control of how it would unfold. With James by her side, not as a crutch, but as a partner, she was ready to embrace the future, her future. And this time, it was built on a foundation of strength, love, and unwavering self-respect.